All right. Well, we are working our way through Hebrews chapter 6. This is in the section of the mediators where he's showing how Jesus is a better high priest than Aaron was. Another reason that his readers should not abandon the new covenant to go back to the old, because the priesthood of the old covenant is not as effective as the priesthood of the new covenant. We saw in chapter 5, he was concerned about their immaturity, that they would be unable to understand the things that he needs to tell them about the superiority of Christ's priesthood. And he points out in verses 4 through 8 that because of their immaturity, they may end up falling away from their commitment to the new covenant. He doesn't want that to happen. So he's trying to bring them up to speed. And that takes us to verse 9. Excuse me a second. Yeah, he gives them some encouragement. This has been a very strong warning in verses 4 through 8. So he doesn't want to discourage them. So he gives them some encouragement in 9 through 12. We see his confidence in verse 9. He says, "But, beloved, we are convinced of better things concerning you." You're not like those people in verses 4 through 8 who fall away. He says, "And things that accompany salvation, though we are speaking in this way." In other words, this has been a severe warning, but even so, I don't think it applies to you. It's real. It can happen, but you're not there. Things that he sees in them, things that accompany salvation. So he's convinced of the better things. This word salvation, as we have seen last time, relates to their receiving the blessing based on their faithfulness. If they maintain their faithfulness in the new covenant and don't fall away, then they will receive the blessing for faithfulness. He uses several words for that same concept. Salvation is one, and hope, and promises. They're all kind of synonyms. As long as you maintain your faithfulness, you will receive the reward. That's what salvation means. We saw that in chapter 1, verse 14, where he talked about inheriting salvation, those who would inherit salvation. And chapter 4, verse 11, where he talked about being diligent to enter God's rest. And you are diligent to enter God's rest if you fulfill your responsibilities faithfully. In essence, he's telling them that they're in line for a blessing. He's confident of that in them. So this is a little encouragement. He's been telling them, don't fall away, and that could get them discouraged. But he doesn't want that. So he encourages them. I see in you good things. Okay? And he explains those in verse 10. We have his reasons for his confidence. Verse 10 says, "For God is not unjust, so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints." So their godly behavior is evidence of their commitment, and they're holding true to that commitment. If they were really going back, then they wouldn't be doing these things. So their behavior is evidence to him of their faithfulness. Interesting side point here. God is not unjust, he says, so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name. How do we express our love toward God? I suppose there are different ways to do that, but in this case, it's by serving each other. So they're showing their love for God. That's their commitment to the new covenant by serving each other. So he's encouraged. He's encouraging them. Then we see the writer's desire for them, verses 11 and 12. He says, "And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end." There we're back to the idea of consistency, being faithful and receiving the blessing for that at the end. In verse 12, "That you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." So there we're inheriting again the promises. The word sluggish there is the same word he used back in chapter 5 when he said that they were dull of hearing. Their spiritual ears were plugged. It's the same word, sluggish. So don't be sluggish. And that's, of course, the opposite of the diligence in verse 11. He's talking to a whole congregation of Jewish believers. Not all of them were tempted to go back to the old covenant. Some were still remaining faithful. The leaders, for example, were. When we get to chapter 10, we'll see that interaction between the leaders and the congregation. So he's saying that he wants all of them, each one of them, to show that same diligence, that same commitment, that same faithfulness. And in chapter 10, he encourages the leaders to guide these people to that faithfulness. Let's see. Be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So he basically wants them to be consistent in their godly behavior because that leads to hope and inheritance. And the hope and inheritance kind of goes back to verse 9, showing that they are in line for a blessing. Question comes up, who are those who through faith and patience inherit the promises? Well, he gives us one in verses 13 to 15, and that's Abraham. So in essence, he's saying, follow Abraham's example of faith and receiving the blessing because of it. We could also throw in there chapter 11, that whole list of Old Testament saints who remained faithful to God even though they suffered for it. And they received the reward at the end. But in this immediate context, he's talking about Abraham. And this is the basis of his encouragement. I see better things from you because of your behavior. I think you're on the right track. I'm not worried about you falling away. But hang in there. Keep it up. This kind of reminds me of what Paul told the Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians. He said, I don't have to teach you anything about loving each other. You're doing that great. Just keep it up. That's kind of what he's telling them here. And even if they're on the borderline, even if there's some there who are wanting to go back, to have a little bit of encouragement like this may prevent them from going back. They may wake up and say, well, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. It may stimulate them to be faithful. So the encouragement is based on God's promise and oath. And we get into that with in verses 13 to 15 with Abraham. So he gives this example of rewards of faith and patience. This takes us back again to verse 12, where he said not to be sluggish, but to be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promise. So he gives Abraham as an example. It says there in 13, for when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. saying, I will surely bless you and will surely multiply you. And thus, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. This, I think, is where the writer starts getting into the details that he told them he was going to back at the beginning of chapter 6. He complained or was worried, concerned because of their immaturity. The last paragraph of chapter 5, the first couple verses, 3 verses of chapter 6, he says, we're not going to review all of that stuff that you should know already, but we're going to go on to maturity. We're going to press on to the deeper things. You may not be able to keep up, but I pray to God that you will. Verse 3. We'll do this if God permits. So starting in verse 13, he's giving them the further instruction. This is some of the deeper things that he was worried that they would not be able to understand. But it's sort of a gradual lead-in to the really deeper stuff. It's like starting at the shallow end of the pool and wading and getting deeper and deeper. So this is kind of the start of the new information, and this has to do with God's promise to Abraham. And we're going to go over the promise and the oath in a couple minutes here. Excuse me. So God promised Abraham, he promised Abraham the land, he promised Abraham a son, and he promised Abraham many descendants through that son. And to be sure that Abraham trusted him, he provided an oath. He swore to it. And we'll see the significance of the promise and the oath as we go on here. So he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you. So we have Abraham and God's promise of blessing, and this is backed up by the oath. And the implication, as we've already seen, is to trust God as Abraham did in order to receive God's promise. Abraham trusted God, and these Jewish readers would know, obviously, that Abraham received the blessing. He received the son, Isaac, and through Isaac we have the whole 12 tribes coming from Abraham. We might have a question there in verse 15 when it says, and thus having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. You might think, wait a minute. As if you go back and read Abraham's story back there in Genesis 12 through 22, you'd think he was not really that patient. God promised him a son, and it wasn't happening, and it wasn't, years are going by, and there's still no son. And so he takes matters into his own hands and produces Ishmael, which is the whole start of all the things we see going on in the Middle East today. It's basically a family squabble between cousins. So he was not entirely patient. It's like people talk about the patience of Job. He wasn't necessarily patient. But why does he say this then? Why does he characterize Abraham as being patiently waiting for the promise? Well, it's his point. We've talked about this before. It's the difference between the Eastern mind and the Western mind. We of the Western mind are influenced by Greek and Roman cultures, and they're very precise and very detail-oriented, and we want all the little details to line up. The Eastern mind always looks at the big picture. The details are not necessarily that important. So he's kind of glossing over a lot of things. He's just making the point. God promised this to Abraham, and Abraham saw the fulfillment. That's basically all you need to know. So he's skipping over a bunch of stuff. If you get the main point, that's all that matters. Excuse me. In verse 18, I'm sorry, not 18, 16 and 17, he gives them assurance of the promise, and that's backed up again by God's oath. He gave the oath to Abraham, but he continues that currently, makes the application currently. Verse 16 says, "For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end of every dispute." So if two people make an agreement and they both swear to uphold their end of the bargain, then discussions are over. And then just go on and do what the agreement requires. So an oath puts an end to every dispute. There's no more argumentation. 17, he has the application. "In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath." So God's doing the same thing that people do when they make an agreement. He made the promise, and now he's backing it up with an oath. He's swearing to uphold his part of the bargain. So he's giving them an analogy that they can deal with, that they can understand. Excuse me. So in 18, he gives them a reminder of their commitment to the hope in the promise. Well, I have to start with the last part of verse 17. So he wanted to assure them of the unchangeableness of his purpose. He interposed with an oath, in order that by two unchangeable things, and those two things are the promise and the oath, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we may have strong encouragement, we who have fled for refuge in laying hold of the hope set before us. So you guys, he's saying, have already committed yourselves to the new covenant because you recognize that this is where the hope lies. So being faithful to your commitment to the new covenant will get you that fulfillment. So don't go back. Stay faithful to the new covenant. And you can do that because God has promised. He's given an oath that he will fulfill those promises as long as you are faithful. So hang in there. You've already made the commitment. Trust God. And we see the reality of that hope in verses 19 and 20. To us, the word hope is kind of iffy. I hope it doesn't rain today. Well, who knows what's going to happen. But you can hope. But hope in the Bible is not that. It's not iffy. It's an assured thing. It's established. It's there. It's waiting. We don't have it yet. So in that sense, we are hoping for it, not because it's iffy, but because we haven't gotten it yet. We're waiting. I suppose in that sense, hope could be defined as, I just had it a second ago. Confident waiting would be a good translation of this idea of hope. It's there, you know it's there, so you're just waiting for it, and you're confident in that. It's going to happen. It just hasn't happened yet. So 19 and 20 talk about the solidity of this hope. It says, "This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil." That's a reference to the tabernacle. The veil is the veil that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement, with the blood of the sacrifice to cover the sins that the people had committed in ignorance the year before. So this hope is already in there in that Holy of Holies in heaven. As it says in verse 20, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. We see this back in chapter 4 and verse 14, where he's encouraging them to be faithful. He says, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. So the fact that Jesus is there and he's on our side, interceding for us, we can be faithful in our commitment. So here we can be assured that that hope is there because Jesus has taken that hope, and that hope is centered in his sacrifice. We will see that more clearly spelled out in chapters 9 and 10. He entered the holy place, the Holy of Holies in heaven, the very presence of God, with his own blood as a sacrifice on our behalf. So we don't have anything to worry about in facing God. The judgment has already been executed on the substitute. But notice this this hope, he says, is an anchor, verse 19. It's not an iffy thing. It gives you stability. And they can use this stability to remain faithful to their commitment. Kind of reminds me of Peter's admonition to his readers. They were undergoing persecution. And he said, in essence, the way to get through it is to keep your eye on the goal. Keep that hope that you're going to receive on Judgment Day. Okay? If you realize that this persecution you're going through isn't going to change your eternal destiny, then you can handle the persecution because it's the eternal destiny that matters. Nothing that happens here is going to affect that. So don't worry about it. That hope, keeping your eye on that hope, is going to give you stability in these fluctuating circumstances. And the writer here is telling them the same thing. This hope is there, and it is an anchor for you to hang on to remain consistent. And Jesus has entered into that Holy of Holies in heaven as our forerunner, a forerunner for us. He has gone before us, and he's kind of there holding the veil open so we can go in as well. At least he would be holding it open if it hadn't torn in two when he was killed on the cross. But it's the same idea. He's gone ahead of us to prepare the way for us so we can enter that Holy of Holies as well. And the reason he could do that, verse 20, is that he's become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So just to finish off the screen up there, this hope is an anchor secured in heaven by Christ the high priest. And it's based on the fact that he was a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now this is not the first time he's mentioned Melchizedek. He's mentioned that back in chapter 5 and verse 10. He's designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And then verse 11, all the way to the end of chapter 6, is a parenthesis where he deals with their immaturity and his attempt to bring them up to maturity. And then at the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7, we're back with Melchizedek. So he has, in explaining God's promise and oath, given them a foundation for understanding what he's going to say about Christ's superior priesthood, illustrated by the priesthood of Melchizedek. So he's kind of built them up slowly to the point where hopefully they'll be able to understand these deeper things. Now the question obviously arises, who was Melchizedek? Well, We'll talk about that later. Right now, I want to go back to this idea of the promise and the oath, just to clarify that. So there's a handout there. If somebody wants to grab those, pass them out. Excuse me. So I'm going to have this up on the screen, but you guys who are sitting here probably won't be able to read the screen, so you got the handout. People watching online may be able to see it better. So this is God's promise and oath, as the reference, of course, is Hebrews 6, what we just saw, verses 13 to 17. But we're going back to Genesis to get an idea of what this promise and oath were. So we can, the Jews that he's writing to would understand all this. Okay, but we don't. All right, so we need to go back and look at it. So you look at the chart, down the left you have references. They're all in Genesis, from Genesis 12 through 22. And then we have the promise in the next column, and the next column is the oath that goes along with the promise, and then the fulfillment of the promise, and then the reaction of Abraham and God in each of these situations. Okay? So Genesis 12, verses 1 to 9, God calls Abraham and he promises him a land and descendants and a blessing. His name is Abram at this point, and he's 75 years old. So Abram is basically a pagan. He's over in Chaldea. I should have put a map up here. It's over above the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates River empty into the Persian Gulf. Just north of that Persian Gulf is Chaldea. Later it was called Babylon. Babylon was the capital city, and eventually the whole area became known as Babylon. But he's a pagan. He's an idol worshiper. And so one day he's going along minding his own business, and God speaks to him and says, "Hey, I have a plan for you. I want you to get up, get your family, get packed, and hit the road, and I'll show you where to go." Didn't even give him directions. Just move, and I'll show you where to go. And he did it. Abram packed up and left with his family and everything. So that in the right-hand column there, under Abraham, his reaction is obedience and worship. Now imagine this guy who's never heard a God speak before. And we don't know how God spoke to him, it doesn't say. But it was enough to get Abram's attention. He's maybe thinking, this is different. This isn't like the idols over there in the temple. This God's alive. And so he obeyed and worshiped. And God's response was to repeat that promise. The promise of the land. Just get going and I'll give you directions and get you to where you need to be. Abram probably thought, well, if he can speak, then he can probably fulfill his promise. So he takes off, and he's 75 years old. Can you imagine when you're 75? I can remember 75, vaguely. Not the time of life when you think of getting up and moving, especially when you don't know where you're going. But he did. Genesis 13, the next chapter, some time has passed, and God promises him the land again and descendants. I'll show you the land and I'll give you descendants. And again, Abram's reaction is to worship. At the end of that paragraph, verse 18. Chapter 15, more time has passed. God renews the promise. He adds to it, actually, protection for Abram, a reward for his obedience. He promises him an heir and descendants. Abraham's response over there in the right, he's concerned about not having an heir because God had already promised him. But it hasn't happened yet. So Abram questions God, I don't have a son yet. Okay, maybe my servant here can fulfill that role. And God says, no, it's going to be a child that you yourself produce. It's not going to be one of your servants. So God repeats the promise of the land and the descendants. And Abraham's reaction to that is faith in verse 6 there. And based on his faith, he's saying, okay, God, if you say I'm going to have a son, now he's certainly older than 75. He says, if you say so, then I believe you. And as a result, it says there, God accounted his faith as righteousness because he trusted. Following that in chapter 15, the next few verses, 7 to 21, we have the oath. He backed up his promise with this solemnization ceremony. And we see Abram's reaction there. He has a concern about possessing the land, but he obeys. And Ishmael is born when Abram is 86 years old. So he didn't really wait for God. You remember the story. Ishmael is born. But before that, God goes through the covenant ceremony. And you remember the story. Abram takes these animals, different kinds of animals, cuts them in half, and makes kind of a pathway between the halves of these animals. And this was a typical agreement ceremony for people back then. They would cut these animals in half and make this little pathway. And then both people would walk down this aisle between these halves of animals, reciting the conditions of the agreement. And then they would make the oath at the end to keep their end of the deal. And the oath that they gave was one that you've read many times in the Old Testament, out of context, because it became just a saying, okay? And you kind of lose the original. But the original was here. They would finish walking through this aisle of dead bodies, reciting the conditions of the agreement, and then they would both swear by saying, may God do so to me and more also if I don't keep my end of the deal. Which is basically saying, may God do to me what we have done to these animals, and even more, if I fail to keep my part of the deal. That was the oath. Okay? But you remember the story. After Abram had lined up all those animals, God put Abram to sleep. And God himself walked down that aisle, reciting the conditions of the covenant and making the oath at the end. Probably not the same oath. It says he swore by himself that he would do this. So this was an unconditional covenant. It wasn't up to what Abraham did or didn't do. God promised, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you in the land. I'm going to give you an heir. You're going to have descendants. And even Abraham's waywardness didn't stop God from fulfilling his promise. He swore by himself that he would do that. So then Genesis 17, he repeats the covenant with him and repeats the promise of descendants in the land. And Abraham now is 99 years old. So Abraham's reaction is to worship because God is still there. And God's part here is a repetition and expansion of the promise and covenant. And he changes Abram's name as a reminder. So Abram becomes Abraham. The name Abram, which in Hebrew is Avram, the A-B is the word for father, Av. And Ram is a word. So Abraham means father of a multitude. But he changed it to Avraham. He added that extra syllable in the middle, which is an intensifier. So this is a father of a huge multitude. And it's a reminder to Abraham that this promise is going to be fulfilled. I've changed your name to match my promise. I've told you you're going to have a son, and you're going to have, through him, you're going to have many, many, many descendants as the sand of the sea, the stars in the sky. So I'm going to change your name to match that. Father of a great, huge multitude. And then continuing Genesis 17, verses 9 to 14, God chooses Abraham's descendants as his people. Out of all the peoples on the earth, God chose Abraham's descendants to be his special people, to be set aside for his special purposes. That's what the word holy means, to be set aside. And he institutes the ceremony of circumcision as a sign of that covenant relationship. It is a physical distinction between Abraham's descendants and all the other nations on the earth. Only the Israelites practice circumcision. Paul talks about that in the first few chapters of Romans. He says, you Jews think you're hot stuff because you have this covenant relationship with God and you have the symbol of circumcision for that covenant. But it's not going to do you any good if you don't follow the covenant. So, it's no big deal by itself. And then in Genesis 17, continuing on, verses 15 to 19, God again promises Abram a son and descendants. Notice how many times he's repeating this. Of course, the time has passed. The years have gone by here. So it's about time to remind Abram what he said, or Abraham by this time. And God's response here, along with this promise, repeated promise, he changes Sarai's name to Sarah, which means princess, again, as a reminder. Abraham's a little skeptical. He says, I'm too old. He was 99 years old earlier, and now he's older than that. Doesn't say exactly. Well, he could still be in his 99th year. But too old to have a child, so is Sarah. But God says, don't worry about that. And he reaffirms the promise and the covenant. I told you you're going to have a son, and you will. Doesn't matter how old you are. And in chapter 18, he again repeats the promise of a son. And this time, the reaction for Abraham is actually Sarah's reaction. She's a little skeptical because she was 90 by this time. That's kind of old for having a child. Okay. So she said, this isn't going to happen. But God confronts her about that. He said, why did you laugh? And she said, I didn't laugh. He said, yes, you did. But he reaffirms the promise. He says, don't laugh. It's going to happen. And then Genesis 21, Abraham is 100 years old, and we see the fulfillment of the promise, the birth of Isaac. Abraham's reaction, he obeys the covenant, and Sarah rejoices. She was skeptical before, but now it's happened, and therefore she's on board with it. I mean, what choice is she going to have? She rejoices. And finally, Genesis 22, God repeats the promise after Abraham shows his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Remember the story. God never intended for Abraham to kill Isaac. It was a test. And we have the explanation there that Abraham thought, well, God made the promise that this son was going to be my heir and produce all of these descendants, and now he's telling me to kill him, so God must be going to raise him from the dead. I mean, what other explanation can there be? So he goes through with it, or at least starts to, and God stops him and reaffirms that promise. And then we have the oath, another oath here. It's the repetition of the oath that he made before when he walked through the animals. And he says, by myself I have sworn, which is what the writer to Hebrews just said. He swore by himself. Abraham's reaction is to show trust in God by going back home and continuing his life. He's no longer worried about it. He says, well, God said he's going to do it. And so far, all these years, he's kept his promise. He's done it, so I can go back to work. I don't have to worry about this. He's taking his hands off the situation and letting God handle it. Finally. So he gets to that point of trust. And that's illustrated by kind of like forgetting the whole thing and going back to work. So that kind of brings us up to speed about what the writer is saying here about this promise and oath. Just as God promised Abraham a son and swore that he would fulfill that promise, and he did, so God will fulfill his promise to these readers regarding their faithfulness to their commitment to the new covenant. If you remain faithful, God will keep his part of the deal and give you that promise, that blessing, that hope at the end. Okay? You enter God's rest when the work is done. But trust God now, even if you go through persecution. Trust God now, and he will keep his part of the deal. Any questions about that? Observations? Okay, so that brings us back to verse 20 of chapter 6. Jesus was able to provide this hope as an anchor because he's a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And chapter 7 begins, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, and he goes on. So we're picking up here basically where we left off in chapter 5 and verse 10. That's where he first compared Jesus to Melchizedek. Chapter 7 verse 1 picks up with Melchizedek. So now the writer is going to go into this deeper truth that he was worried that these readers might not be able to understand. So with all of this about Abraham and everything, he's brought them up to the place where he's confident that they can understand. So he's ready to go on. But that still doesn't explain who Melchizedek was. But we're out of time. So we'll have to pick up next time. We won't be here probably next week and the week after because of Christmas and New Year's. Okay. In the meantime, if you want a head start on this, you could read Genesis 14. That's the story of Melchizedek. Now you will either, when you finish reading chapter 14, you'll either say, oh, I get it, or you'll say, what is this all about? We shall see. Okay. So we will get into Melchizedek next time. So any other observations or comments? All right. Then let's close in prayer. Father, again, we thank you that you've given us plenty of reason to trust. both from your word and from our own experiences. We pray that you will enable us to live in that trust and do the things you have for us to do, because we depend on your enablement and we know it's there. In Jesus' name, amen.